When President Lyndon Johnson launched his War on Poverty in 1964 at the University of Michigan, he said there were 3 places where we begin to build the Great Society: in our cities, in our countryside, and in our classrooms. That speech marked the beginning of more than half a century of federal spending on education programs from preschool through graduate school. Unfortunately, or perhaps predictably, the federal government's foray into the infinitely complex domain of what and how children learn has not led to better learning outcomes. As we explain in the Heritage Foundation's new book, Johnson's program led to what we call the not-so-great society. In early childhood education, the federal Head Start preschool program, launched as a part of the War on Poverty, has had little to no impact on parenting practices or the cognitive, social, emotional, and health outcomes of children. In K through 12, the achievement gap between disadvantaged students and their more affluent peers remains the same today as it was in 1964. Affluent students are still 4 years ahead in learning. And in higher education, 5 decades after the Great Society got the federal government into the business of guaranteeing student loans, Americans hold more than $1.6 trillion in outstanding student loan debt. And the irony? 44% of recent college graduates are in jobs that don't require a college degree. So what's to be done? In education, the first step is a bold one: get Washington out. Education should return to its roots in the earliest days of the Republic, when parents played a central role in choosing how and where their kids learned, and when students, if they choose to go to college, paid their way without making the Faustian bargain of taking a federal loan. In other words, the Department of Education should no longer be a cabinet-level agency. Our new book devotes an entire section to solutions at the pre-K, K through 12, and post-secondary levels. Heritage has solutions to help lawmakers and education officials at all levels. But more importantly, we offer ways to help parents and students and give every child great learning options that prepare them for life.
Good afternoon. I'm Charmaine Yoest, and I'm the Vice President of the Institute for Family, Community, and Opportunity. And so that means I'm the one who gets to oversee the education program, and we are really excited to be able to talk to you about this with this panel. I feel like we've really had Andy in the previous panel kind of set it up, and it's our job to kind of hit it out of the park now. It's almost as if someone planned it that way. So I am one of the people who raised their hand that this was my first President's Club. And it's because I just started here at Heritage in March. And I'm so very glad to have this opportunity to come before you. First, to have a chance to meet many of you. I hope over the next couple days I'll have that chance in person. But I wanted to take this opportunity to thank you all so much for enabling the work that we do. For the last 2 years, I served in the Trump administration. Just before coming to Heritage, I was serving in the White House in the Office of Drug Control Policy. And before that, I was over the Department of Health and Human Services. And I like to tell people that I feel like I won the lottery by joining Heritage Foundation at this time now. For me, it was a little bit emotional to watch the video of Kay Coles-James over the years, because I have known her for many of those years. I recognize so many of those pictures. So when I heard that she was taking over Heritage Foundation, there was this little voice in my head that thought, wow, it would be amazing to get to be at Heritage. And so when this opportunity came available, I jumped at it. And the reason is twofold. One is to have the opportunity to work under Kay James's leadership with the bold vision that she has. And part of that vision is helping to chart forward where the conservative movement is going next in these tumultuous days. That is a real privilege, and thank you for enabling that. So with that as a setup, that's what this panel is about, is to talk about where we're going with education. And I'm really excited to be able to tell you that we opened up the boxes just last night in delivery of the new report that we are pre-releasing to you today of the Not So Great Society. And what this is an edited volume that Lindsey Burke, who heads up our Education Center, and Jonathan Butcher have edited to talk about what a conservative vision for education reform looks like. Back in 1964, Lyndon Johnson launched the Great Society, as you all know. But what many people don't realize is what Mary Claire talked about in the video, is that education was one of the primary pillars that he sketched out for how we achieve the Great Society. But what's happened? We've spent $2 trillion since then, $2 trillion, and every single metric of educational achievement has been flat. I like to tell people that what we've essentially accomplished is this Ponzi scheme of federal funding. The one thing, the one metric that's gone skyrocketing upward is the number of educational bureaucrats that we have at both the federal and state level. And what we're seeing now, and this is written out in the report that we're going to have available for you in the back, is that all of the federal regulations that have been passed at the top have come down to the state level, and our schools have all had to hire administrators to fill out the forms that are coming as a mandate from the federal government. And that's why today we are calling for moving education out of the federal realm back to the states where it belongs. Most importantly, it's not just the money, it's also the ethos and the idea that somehow at the federal level, we can tell communities and most importantly parents how to educate their children. That's the real tussle, that's the real struggle that we're having today. We talked a little bit earlier about the challenges that we're seeing to parental rights. We're very much seeing it in the education arena today. As we've seen that shift towards an educational bureaucracy, we've moved education away from an emphasis on civil society. And the problem with that is civil society is where we form the character of children that is completely necessary for any kind of education to thrive and to take hold and to really launch them into the futures that they deserve. We like to say that we need to move away from the idea of the Great Society to building great hearts among our children. So in order to talk a little bit more about that, I'm so pleased to first be able to introduce to you Dr. Lindsey Burke, who is the Will Skillman Fellow in Education Policy and the Director of our Center for Education Policy, and also the editor of the Not So Great Society. Lindsey, come join us.
Great. Well, thank you, Charmaine, and thanks to all of you for being here today. I am thrilled to be able to talk about our new book here at President's Club because it is because of you, our President's Club members, that this book is possible. And Charmaine's right, we literally got it off back from the printer this morning, so we were really, really excited to have it ready for President's Club this afternoon. So how did we get to the point that we are at today? A federal Department of Education with 4,400 employees, by the way, making an average salary of $103,000, with a federal government intimately involved in what and how your children learn, despite no constitutional authority to do so. How did we get to this point? A little quick history is in order. From the founding of the Republic until basically 1944, we had very little federal intervention in education. You can see in 1867, there was actually a federal Department of Education that got formed, but it was downgraded quickly 1 year later to just a small office to gather statistics. There were 4 statisticians in that office. So it was quickly downgraded. But you can see in 1944, we had a little more federal involvement. The GI Bill passes, providing our service members support to pursue higher education. Totally appropriate. But then something changes, something pretty significant. The Soviets launched Sputnik, the first Earth-orbiting satellite. And then just a month later, this was October of '57, just a month later, they launched a second Sputnik satellite. So this catalyzes President Eisenhower to really begin to leverage the federal government, federal spending, to support more mathematicians and more scientists. But even at this point, it was a national security imperative that Eisenhower said, that we would, quote, best the communists on their own terms. So it was appropriate at that point. There was a national security prerogative. But then we see a major shift. President Lyndon Johnson enters office, and in his very first State of the Union address, he proclaimed, quote, "This administration here and today now declares unconditional war on poverty." So what that did was it quickly took the federal government from leveraging some federal education spending to fight a war with the Soviets, to fight that so that they would not come home to America, to fighting a war on poverty at home on the domestic front. It was a major shift that launched what became known as the Great Society Initiative. So this was 1965, and as we all know, the Great Society programs were comprehensive. There was a comprehensive package of Medicaid and Medicare and food stamps. But what most people don't know is that the war on poverty, a third of it, Johnson said, would be fought in the classrooms of America. There, he said, your children's lives will be shaped. This was major federal intervention in 3 particular areas. The Federal Head Start program launches, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act launches, and the Higher Education Act launches. So what have we seen as a result? You got a taste of this in Mary Claire's video, but the Federal Head Start program, unfortunately, which had its goal was to quote Lady Bird Johnson, rescue our disadvantaged children, unfortunately, it has utterly failed in that mission. We have spent $240 billion on Head Start since it was launched as a small summer program in 1965. And we have seen no impact on parents' parenting practices, their children's social emotional well-being, their access to health care, nothing. What do we have today? What is that legacy? It is a $9 billion a year federal jobs program, if we're being honest. Head Start employs 265,000 adults in that program. But the cornerstone of Johnson's education component of his war on poverty was the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. This also passed in '65, and it passed to provide a little additional federal funding to low-income students to try to improve outcomes between poor children and their more affluent peers. Unfortunately, it has not achieved its goal either. Since 1965, since the Great Society launched, we have seen federal education spending quadruple in real terms. Inflation-adjusted spending has quadrupled. And yet, that achievement gap remains. In 1965, when the Great Society launched, there was a 4-year gap in the difference in learning between poor children and their more affluent peers. Today, there is a 4-year gap in learning. We have not moved the needle at all. But as Charmaine alluded to, we have seen significant administrative bloat. Since the Great Society programs launched, we have seen a 137% increase in non-teaching administrative staff in public schools across the country. Paul Peterson writes in our book, he's a professor at Harvard, that the Great Society, in the wake of those programs, did not focus on teacher quality. Instead, it focused on administrators. And he says, quote, "The quality of entering teachers declined steadily. The percentage of teachers coming from the least selective colleges doubled in the wake of the Great Society." But it's not just in the K-12 realm that unfortunately we saw big government failure. Higher education, of course, has been an utter disaster when we look at the outcome of federal spending and programs. When the Great Society launched, that was the first time the federal government began underwriting private student loans and grants for students broadly. We now have today a federal government that originates and services 90% of all student loans. 90% come directly from the federal government. That means that when students default or when there is generous loan forgiveness, that taxpayers pick up the tab. And what is incredible is that today, a slightly smaller proportion of low-income students attend college than did so in 1965. So it's failed on that metric. It's still astounding to say out loud, $1.6 trillion with a T dollars in outstanding student loan debt. And as Mary Claire mentioned in that video, 44% of recent college graduates are in jobs that do not require a college degree. Neil McCluskey writes in our book that, quote, rather than fueling increases in human capital, federal help has powered a credential treadmill that has forced everyone to run faster just to stay in place. So in the final analysis, whether it is grade school or grad school, the Great Society programs have utterly failed to improve outcomes. But you don't have to take my word for it. This is the Marlowe family, who we profile in our book. This is Mrs. Marlowe and her husband sitting next to President Lyndon Johnson in 1964. This was May 7th, to be precise. When President Johnson was selling his Great Society initiative, going on a tour around the country, he went down to Rocky Mount, North Carolina, and they picked out the Marlowe family specifically to be the poster child to sell their Great Society initiatives. They were a low-income family with 8 children, and the father was out of work. And so he goes, they are all over the media, they get a ton of media attention that they didn't anticipate. And after President Johnson leaves, Mrs. Marlowe writes him a letter, and this is from her letter. Quote, she says, Mr. Johnson, since your poverty campaign visit to our home on May 7th, we haven't had a peaceful day. We cannot get credit, for we are now branded the poorest folks in the nation. Since the trouble started with your visit, we would be grateful for any help. She later got an anonymous check for $200. So the Great Society didn't help the Marlowe family. It has not helped American students across the country. And that is because federal programs cannot replace individual responsibility and strong families. What the Great Society did do was create a fundamental misalignment of power and incentives that shifted federal oversight of education to the federal level, away from families and away from local school leaders. And so what we are here today to tell you is that it's time. We have half a century of evidence to reject the Great Society and re-embrace civil society. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lindsey. It's my great honor now to be able to introduce to you Dr. Patrick Wolf, who is the Distinguished Professor and 21st Century Chair in School Choice from the University of Arkansas. And I hope you'll join me in giving Patrick a really warm welcome because he fought his way here today through a tornado.
Well, thank you, Charmaine. It was going to take a lot more than a mere tornado to keep me from being with you today to talk about one of my favorite topics, and that is what the research evidence says about educational choice. So I'm going to be speaking to you today as an independent scholar with more than 20 years of experience evaluating choice. But I have to issue this disclaimer that my opinions will not necessarily represent those of my employer. So, got to do it. So what's private school choice? That's what I'm going to focus on today is private school choice programs. And they are really any arrangement that supports parents in choosing a private school for their child, either secular or religious. And they are an alternative to both residential assignment to traditional public schools and various public school choice options, many of which are governed by the school district themselves, such as magnet schooling and interdistrict choice, et cetera. The 3 most prominent forms of private school choice are private school vouchers, tax credit scholarships, and the newest and most innovative form is education savings accounts. And the nation's foremost expert on ESAs is Dr. Lindsey Burke. So we hear a lot of strong claims about private school choice and what it does. For example, we hear there's no evidence that students in voucher schools get higher test scores. This from education historian Diane Ravitch. We hear that the findings on both achievement and attainment for private school choice are mixed, with no clear patterns. This is from ed school professors Lubinsky and Brewer. And finally, we hear from ed school professor David Berliner in sworn testimony before the Texas legislature that voucher programs could end up resembling the ethnic cleansing currently occurring in Kosovo. So give parents private school options for their kids, and you might get ethnic cleansing, according to Professor Berliner. So, are they right? Are they true? I'm going to walk you through the research evidence on school choice. I'm going to use a couple of visual cues so that we can cover over 50 research studies in less than 5 minutes. And those include medals to designate different levels of rigor in the studies. Gold standard studies use random assignment to create a private school treatment group and a control group. They are the gold standard. Silver standard studies use some other alternative statistical technique to try and control for what we call selection bias or self-selection bias into private schooling. And bronze standard studies simply collect evidence on measurable characteristics of students and control for those measurable features. So gold beats silver, which beats bronze. And I'll use the medals to designate which groups of studies or individual studies have those various levels of rigor. I'm going to include evaluations of any private school choice program, and I'm going to use a stoplight type of highlighting system. So if the results were positive for all participants in the study regarding private school choice, those studies will be highlighted with forest green in the background. If they were at least positive for important subgroups of students, that will appear in light green. Null findings of no significant difference between the private school choice students and the comparison students will appear in yellow, and negative effects for private school choice will be highlighted in red. So here we go. We'll start with achievement, and there are enough randomized controlled trials gold standard studies of the effects of private school choice on achievement outcomes that we can focus exclusively on those 16 studies. And what we find is clear evidence that private school choice boosts student test scores. There are 6 studies that found that was clear for all participants in the program. An additional 4 studies found clear positive effects, at least for disadvantaged subgroups of participants, especially African American students. Another 4 studies found no difference, no significant difference in test score outcomes for the voucher and comparison groups. And finally, there are 2 studies that did find negative achievement impacts, especially in math. But they were both of a program in Louisiana that is the most heavily regulated private school choice program in the country. So highly regulated private school choice doesn't deliver the test score benefits that the less regulated programs have. Now let's move on and look at educational attainment. This is a photo of my family from 2 years ago, where my older son was graduating from the University of Arkansas. And we threw a party for Alex that day. We throw parties for people when they graduate because educational attainment, that is how far you go in school, punctuated by degree achievements of diplomas and bachelor's degrees, etc. Educational attainment is far more predictive of positive life outcomes than test scores are. As I like to say it, in education, how far you go matters more than how much you know. So there have only been 7 evaluations of the effect of private school choice on educational attainment, but they tilt decidedly positive. 5 have found clear positive effects in boosting the likelihood of graduation at various levels of the education system for students. Overall, a 6th study found those clear positive effects, at least for African American students, and only 1 study by Matt Chingos at the Urban Institute found no significant difference between choice students and the control group. Finally, let's look at civic outcomes. We ask our schools to do more than just teach students reading, writing, and arithmetic and give them degrees. We rely upon them to prepare the next generation of democratic citizens to operate in our republic. And so it's important to examine the civic outcomes of different types of schools. And here I'm talking about values such as political tolerance, political involvement, political knowledge, volunteerism in one's community, and racial integration. Those are the 5 civic values we're going to review here. And basically, what I'm going to present here is a more expansive review than is in the book chapter. And it's more expansive in 2 ways. One is it includes studies just of private schooling and not necessarily of private school choice initiatives. And secondly, it includes bronze standard studies as well as gold and silver, just so that I can't be accused of suppressing any of the evidence. I mean, this is all the evidence on private school choice and civic values, but it tracks very closely with what we present in the book. What we find is there are 56 statistical findings that private schooling has positive effects on civic outcomes for students. There are 34 findings of no difference between government-controlled public schools and privately run private schools in terms of the democratic values of the students. And finally, there are only 3 findings out of 93 that going to a private school actually diminishes civic outcomes. So, in summary, yes, there is evidence that school choice boosts achievement. Yes, there is a clear pattern that private school choice enhances educational attainment. And basically, access to private schooling makes young people more and not less civically minded. There's no Kosovo going on surrounding private education. So really the summary is that school choice is good. It's great for our society. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. And you all should actually ask him to show you his Heritage Foundation socks. Okay, it is now my opportunity to introduce to you Dr. Robert Jackson, who is another author in our volume that we're releasing today. He is the Chief Academic Officer of the Great Hearts Academy, and he was very gracious in allowing me to plagiarize Great Hearts Academy for our tagline of moving from the Great Society to Great Hearts. And he is also the director of the Institute for Classical Education. Rob, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me, Charmaine. It is my pleasure to be a contributor to this volume, focusing on the story, really the history of classical charter schools, K-12 public charter schools here in the United States. I stand before you as the representative of one of the largest providers of classical education. The Great Hearts Academies now number 30 in 3 metropolitan areas, Phoenix, San Antonio, and the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And those schools are truly the response to the desire of families to have a more coherent and more compelling education for their children. I have to apologize up front, however, for the fact that I do not have slides. In our schools, you will find a kind of low-tech approach. Not that we're averse to technology, and we all have our handheld devices, but our methods are a bit more, well, Renaissance. We prefer to literally manipulate the text, right? To take hold of those books in print, feel the paper, and make the notes in the margins. And we encourage a Socratic exchange with students. So if I was to demonstrate for you today our method, I would have distributed perhaps the Declaration and the Constitution, maybe one of Madison or Hamilton's Federalist Papers, and then we would have had a conversation about the nature of the founding of our regime. That is the type of work that we do in these K-12 charter schools. Now, I think this group is very fond of returning to the founders, which I think is laudable. That is, in fact, they are the source of our American genius. But we should not forget that the debates that took place in the Constitutional Convention were fairly divisive. You'll recall the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. You'll recall the debates over apportionment for representation, or perhaps the Electoral College, and of course, that egregious institution of slavery and how to approach that. These were extremely contentious issues at the time, debated with all the vigor of ultimate concern. So how did those constitutional delegates eventually arrive at a common cause? They drew upon first principles. And I know that you're familiar with these because Heritage is very explicit about the individual liberty, the economic freedom, about the requirements of virtue, the traditional values that are advocated here. Well, our founders understood those principles and, in fact, received them largely from an education that emphasized the philosophical and the historical origins of free men. That Latin term, libertas, right, they knew was founded upon a liberal arts education. They knew how to conduct a civil debate in order to produce the necessary compromises of political life. And thus, the debates of Jefferson, Madison, Adams, Hamilton, and the rest were adjudicated by an education that today we are calling classical. A reading of great books, philosophy, history, and literature, along with mathematics and the sciences. This liberal arts approach is what we are calling classical, and it was integrative. It was absolutely essential to the founders' experience. As I said, here we are, 240 years later, and I represent an organization that is tapped into the desire of families to choose. Some, as Professor Wolf described, are using private choice in order to place their students in schools that align with their values and promote an education that is coherent. Others, like the 12,000 families and 19,000 students at Great Hearts Academies, are choosing a charter school option. I said we are the largest. There are another 200 classical charters that dot the land, and we are providing support and encouragement for them as we have put forward, as was mentioned, an institute aiming at and focusing on the quality of classical education in the US. Our remarkable growth is clearly attributable to the desire of families. What they want for their children is the same that George Washington wanted for his nephew. Perhaps you know that George and Martha did not have their own children, but were entrusted with his nephew, his brother's son, and were determined to give him what we would today call a classical education that George never had. As surveyor and military man, he looked as the leader and founder, one of the first president of these United States. He saw in the men with whom he associated the value of a classical education and was determined to give it to his nephew. That moniker classical explains our approach in distinction to our progressive counterpart. It represents a renaissance of traditional education. We focus, as I said, on timeless texts and perennial ideas. Imagine, for example, with the social justice warriors who are coming from every imaginable corner, if we were simply to have a conversation about the nature of justice in Plato's Republic. We do that in our high schools. Imagine, for example, that we were to have a conversation about the need, the essential human need for community, to describe the nature of friendship as Aristotle understood it, the common pursuit of virtue. Or imagine, for example, that we were trying to explain to our students the role of personal responsibility and reading through Virgil's founding myth of Rome as Aeneas takes his father, his elderly father, and his young son out of the burning city to go and found a new city. Of course, the founders looked to Rome as their model. They knew the story of Aeneas and were determined to produce its best form. But the renewal that I'm referring to that exists in these 30 schools known as Great Hearts is taking place elsewhere. In the public sector, yes, also in private schools, and even in homeschooling, which is a burgeoning realm. Probably 300,000 to 400,000 parents are choosing a classical form of education for their children at home. And many of them are then joining the schools known as classical. And what are you to make of this? How can I define this for you more clearly? As I said, we read great works throughout their experience in school. It is in fact shaped by Western civilization, which, as Professor Gelzo mentioned earlier, is falling out of fashion, both with the New York Times and the educational project that they are promoting. We equip students with the skills of language, traditional oratory, as it was called, in order to take truth and goodness and promote those in the public square. We cultivate students in the pursuit of human excellence, intellectual life, moral life, and aesthetics, that is to say, an appreciation for beauty. We immerse students in a school culture made up of adults who are taking the same responsibility upon themselves that is expected of the students. A place where humility, friendship, personal and civic responsibility are all located in regard to human dignity. And we provide students, and I think this is most crucial, with a Socratic pedagogy that echoes the dialogues of Plato, presenting that master teacher Socrates as a guide to exposing the hypocrisy of the sophists and exploring the very deepest questions of our human experience. We believe in these classical schools that the lifelong pursuit of truth, of goodness and beauty is in fact the most fulfilling life imaginable. Within the last 18 months, the Great Hearts Foundation launched the Institute for Classical Education to promote scholarship, the likes of which you have seen here and will continue to see at Heritage. The research and publication needed to make a case for a recovery of classical education, and ultimately to establish a voluntary association of these classical schools, including those schooling at home. I was challenged this morning by Rear Admiral Black's prayer that the Lord would help us to reconsider what our true wealth is in this United States, not in selfish indulgence, but in service to the Lord and to our neighbor. I sense that we are here to serve the next generation, as the young woman said earlier, our progeny, and to provide them an understanding of the principles of true freedom, of ordered liberty, which we find in Scripture, we find in the founding documents, and throughout the greatest works of literature in our tradition. That would be an education worthy of the founders, and one that would provide hope for the next generation. I hope you will, since I don't have a slide, take a look at the website, classicaleducation.institute, to learn more about the work we're doing. And if you do have a chance to pick up the volume, The Not So Great Society, read the story of classical K-12 education and become a part of it, as it is in your communities, I'm sure. I'll help you locate a school, and you can be one of the benefactors of those programs. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Well, I don't know about you all, but a lot of times when I hear and we discuss education policy, it can be very sobering because there's so many challenges that we've identified and that we think are problematic. But our job and our mission at the Heritage Foundation is to chart forward a positive path and to provide solutions. And so I'm hoping, we've got about 10 minutes left on the panel, and I'd like for us amongst ourselves here in the time we have left to talk a little bit about optimism and things that we see that we're excited about and that we think are charting a positive path forward. And Lindsey, can you kick us off, because you and I get to talk a lot, and I would like for our audience to hear a little bit about your thoughts on this idea of devolving the Department of Education. I mean, come on, realistically, is that actually possible, and what would that look like?
Well, it's a bold idea, devolving the Department of Ed, no longer having the Department of Education as a cabinet-level agency. And I think it aligns perfectly with the True North statement that we heard articulated so beautifully earlier. And I would just remind everyone that the Department of Education has only been a cabinet-level agency since 1980. It has not been around since the beginning of time. What has been around since the beginning of time is what Robert Jackson just articulated. I would much rather have my children in his hands than in the hands of a federal agency that has really produced very little over the past 40 years or so, and then on back to the Great Society Initiative that we talked about earlier, the past half century. But I am optimistic, just like you're optimistic, and I'm optimistic because of the work that we've done in the States. I think we have, if we could cue it up, 2 maps that illustrate that. We'll see how tech savvy we are. But if you think about how education is structured, what is important to remember is that the federal government is a small financer of education policy. It is only an 8.5% stakeholder in everything that we spend on education at the K-12 level. Where the action is in the states, which is why we have been so laser-like focused, particularly in the school choice realm, on advancing education choice in the states. This map shows the states where there are now school choice options in place, particularly ESAs and ESAs under consideration, where we've been working in the states to make that happen. You heard Dr. Wolf talk a few minutes ago about education savings accounts. This is sort of the newest iteration of a school voucher, a more flexible option. And then if we could show the other map as well. Obviously, one of the areas that we are the most concerned about today is in higher education and protecting free speech on college campuses. My colleague, Jonathan Butcher, has done the best work on this issue in the country. He's been testifying in states like Alabama and South Carolina just over the past year and a half or so to make sure that we are actually protecting free speech on campuses, that students should have their ability to have their voices heard, to be able to exercise their First Amendment rights, and that other students should not be able to abridge that First Amendment right. And so I'm optimistic, to answer your question, because we are seeing so much fantastic work in the states move forward, being considered by state legislators, actually being implemented, particularly in the realm of school choice and protecting free speech on college campuses.
Well, that sets us up pretty well for the question that I have for you, Patrick. I was really interested in your data on that we're able to demonstrate that there isn't really a decline in civic engagement. Am I understanding that correctly as it relates to school choice? I think you hear a lot of people feeling that there has to be a real a mandate coming from the federal government in order to ensure that we don't have the balkanization in as large of a country and as diverse of a country as we do. And particularly given the intensity of the debates that we're having today and the divisions that we're seeing in the country, how do you see school choice interacting with that natural desire to have kind of a unity across the country in education?
Well, that's an excellent question. I think the important thing to understand about parental school choice is it's a Tocquevillian policy. It has deep Tocquevillian roots. The idea is for communities to come together and implement a shared vision of education for their children without heavy-handed directives from government officials, and to take an approach to education that they're all comfortable with, and for everyone to be in that school voluntarily. Mm-hmm. Teachers, students, parents, it's all voluntary, and under those circumstances, people feel a freedom to engage on controversial ideas and to discuss respectfully differences of opinion. Whereas in the kinds of educational environments controlled by government organizations, there's a fear of respectful disagreement. And so you often find a much more dynamic engagement and willingness to engage controversial ideas in private schools of choice than you do in government-run traditional public schools. And I think that's the roots of the private school choice advantage when it comes to civic values.
So that actually leads to very closely to what I wanted to ask you about, Rob. I have to tell you, listening to you talk about classical education, I feel an actual real pang in my heart because I so very much wanted my own children to have a classical education experience, and it wasn't an opportunity anywhere near us. But when I hear Patrick talking about where education is heading today and being sure that we're keeping up with the 21st century, there's so much of an emphasis on STEM and the complexity of the international world, the world just keeps getting smaller and smaller. Is Aristotle really relevant at this point?
Yeah, we're confident that he is. And let me be very clear, these prep schools, right, the upper grades of any classical school will be studying science every year, right on through in our schools to 2 years of physics. They'll study 2 years of calculus. So the intention is to prepare them to be fully equipped, right, to enter the contemporary realm, right, society, and speak to the issues of our day. I often say that we highlight the bookends of STEM, right, science and mathematics, right. The technology and the engineering will come. They are techne, right? They are the techniques and the application of those of science and mathematics, but they will get a very robust introduction to the bookends, so as to equip them. And in some cases, in fact, more than half of our graduates are going into STEM fields, so-called, as they leave their high school, because they feel equipped not only with the larger questions of human nature, but then to dive in, right, to those fields. But I think it's important to recollect, we got a bit of the timeline, right, from Lindsey, and I appreciated that. But if we were to stretch that back even further, a few centuries, we know that the sciences came out of what was once called natural philosophy, that the philosophical frames this. And to be very practical about this, I'm thinking that in our day, in the age when bioethics and the exploration of the genome and designer babies, right, are sort of the rage, we need philosophically thoughtful people to enter the fields of STEM and to speak with clarity and with a compelling vision of what it means to be human. I can't remember the fellow's name for the life of me, the Human Genome Project, Francis Collins, yeah. I mean, his articulation.
It's a smart audience.
Thank you. Yeah, I knew they were. I know they are. But Collins's work, right, is framing that particular line of inquiry in a way that's reasonable and that is focused and anchored in human dignity. Leon Cass, obviously a trained physician, and his time, along with his late wife Amy at the University of Chicago, the kind of work they have done. They sat on the President's Council for Bioethics, and I think articulated something more humane and more robust than you would find in virtually any lab. And it's that type of philosophical and yet very technically proficient understanding that is most needed at this time. So STEM, yeah, we got that, but we're getting the preparation to launch them into the world.
Okay, I actually have more questions that I want to ask, and I'm hoping that you do as well. You are an amazingly attentive audience, and I'm kind of conscious that we're now at 4:15 in the afternoon, which is usually the time people start to flag. I'm going to go ahead and stop here because I want to give you guys time to get some coffee and move around a little bit. But I want to encourage you two things. One, Do think of your questions, and be sure to come back tonight to the reception, because these guys will be here in order to sign the book. Pick up your book in the back of the room, because we are really excited to be able to give you these advance copies. The formal launch of the book is going to be next month at the National Press Club, but we've got advance copies for you here, and our authors will be willing to answer questions and to sign the books for you tonight at the reception. But I want you to be sure that you do come back and be here by 4:30, because I have a particular interest in the next panel as well, because it's also coming from the Institute for Family, Community, and Opportunity to talk about healthcare. And there's going to be, just as a tease, there's a little bit of breaking news. So please get a little bit of a refreshment and then come back and rejoin us at 4:30. Thank you.